Hello, welcome to our lecture on the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, some hints I can give you guys, there's a lot of confusing terminology. Out of all the terminology in this class, the autonomic nervous system is probably the most confusing for students. So remember, make a little notepad and write out your definitions explicitly. If you can keep all the terminology straight, you'll have a much better chance of getting through this material quickly and easily. Let's go ahead and get started. So I have a title slide here which shows the autonomic nervous system. On the left side of the screen, we can see the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Remember, this is your fight or flight response. Over here on the right side, we have the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Right, this is what's controlling homeostasis, basically your rest and digest. And you can see the different effects of the different branches of the ANS. I encourage you to take a look at this figure once we've gotten through all the material in this chapter, and it's a very useful resource. But I'll leave it to the end to fully explain. So before we really dive into this, let's have a brief overview, right? So up until this point, we've pretty much talked about the somatic nervous system, right? This is a slightly different way of grouping it than we talked before. So before, we were just talking about one integrated nervous system, then it's split between sensory and motor. Sensory was separated between visceral and somatic. Motor was separated between somatic and autonomic. Autonomic was then separated into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Here, when we're talking about the somatic nervous system, we're talking about somatic sensory and somatic motor. So this would be information that you're consciously aware of, right? Sensation, stimulus that you're consciously aware of, that's your somatic sensory. And then motion that you have control over, basically skeletal muscle, that was your somatic motor. So those two things together, somatic sensory, somatic motor, make your somatic nervous system. I haven't used this term before, so I just want to make sure it's clear in your brain. And the autonomic nervous system, right, the autonomic nervous system controls things that you are not consciously aware of. So we're going to talk about this first figure right here as a review, and I will bring up this figure again and talk about what's going on the right-hand side. For right now, as a review of the somatic nervous system, it's going to start with some kind of receptor that can pick up a stimulus, an interaction with the outside world, like a Meissner's corpuscle, Pacinian corpuscle, the tactile corpuscle. Right? It has some interaction with the world, generates an action potential in the dendrite of a somatic sensory neuron. The dendrite of that somatic sensory neuron travels through the wall of the body, travels through a nerve, and you can see it making its way to the anterior ramus, to the spinal nerve, and then it makes its way to the posterior root. Here in the posterior root ganglion, we have the cell bodies of, in this case, a somatic sensory neuron. The axon then is going to extend into the posterior rootlets and then into that posterior gray horn of spinal cord, right? That is our afferent pathway going towards the central nervous system. Once there, we're going to have a motor neuron, an efferent pathway. Here, likewise, one neuron, in this case, we'll have a multipolar neuron in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. Its dendrites or cell body gets activated, then an action potential will travel down its axon, exiting the anterior rootlets to the anterior root to the spinal nerve, back down the nerve of the body, and then it will have a neuromuscular junction with a skeletal muscle cell, because this is a somatic motor neuron. So I just gave a long list of terminology that is pretty much all review from the previous sections of our nervous tissue. All that terminology has got to be down pat. It's got to make complete sense. If it doesn't, go back and review all that and get that clear, because as we proceed forward in this chapter, I'm going to add about 3 levels of confusion on top of it. So let me go through this one more time and make sure everything's clear. We're going to start afferent, moving towards the CNS, and then we'll finish efferent, moving away from the CNS. So it starts with a receptor. In this case, it looks like a lamellated corpuscle sensing deep pressure. This gets activated, generates an action potential in the dendrite of a somatic sensory neuron. That dendrite, we can follow its path through the body to the spinal nerve, to the posterior root ganglion, where we will find the soma of the somatic sensory neuron in the posterior root ganglion. This happens to be a unipolar neuron. The axon then passes through the posterior root to the posterior rootlets, and then enters the posterior gray horn. Here it will have a synapse with an interneuron, or perhaps it will directly synapse with a multipolar somatic motor neuron in the anterior gray horn, because that's where you find the somas of somatic motor neurons. You find them in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, right? Multipolar neuron. Its axon then exits the anterior rootlets to the anterior root to the spinal nerve anterior ramus, and will eventually form a neuromuscular junction at its skeletal muscle effector. So hopefully all that terminology is clear, because it's about ready to get a lot more confusing. Okay, so as I just went through, or actually I should say, as I reviewed for the somatic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system also has both sensory and motor neurons. I haven't talked about those yet, but do you remember way back to the first chapter of the nervous system, we talked about visceral sensory neurons? Well, the visceral sensory neurons, carrying information you're not consciously aware of, right? This is the afferent pathway for the autonomic nervous system, right? That's what's carrying sensory information to the CNS. So in the CNS, somatic motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle fibers, causing conscious voluntary movement. Fair enough. Autonomic motor neurons, right, they're going to innervate things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands, all things that we do not have conscious control over. The one thing to remember, autonomic motor neurons can either excite or inhibit cells. So what that means is you might turn on something, like a particular autonomic neuron may turn on your salivary gland, or it may turn off the salivary gland. So it can be a little bit confusing. All right. In the somatic nervous system, you have one single motor neuron that goes from the spinal cord to a skeletal muscle cell. So you go from the CNS to the PNS in one shot. Specifically, you go from the spinal cord to the skeletal muscle cell in one go, in one neuron. You may have multiple neurons in a motor pathway, including the brain and other parts of the spinal cord. But the last step, the one that we talked about, in the anterior gray horn, you will find the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons. Their axon will reach all the way to your effector, the skeletal muscle cell. One neuronal pathway from the CNS. In the autonomic nervous system, we're going to have a 2-neuron chain. So remember, the cell bodies for autonomic motor neurons are housed in the lateral gray horns of the spinal cord and also in the brainstem. Well, no, I lied. Just in the lateral gray horns. But we're going to have a 2-neuronal pathway. So if you have 2 neurons, that means you're going to have a synapse. So we're going to name the neurons and their axons based on their position in the synapse. Right? If you're going to have a synapse out in the body somewhere, that means there are going to be collections of cell bodies out in the peripheral nervous system. What do we call a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system? Right? You should all remember from that chart I had you memorize with the definitions, A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So far, the only ganglion we've talked about is the posterior root ganglion. In the posterior root ganglion, we saw the cell bodies of visceral and somatic sensory neurons. But here in our motor pathway, our efferent pathway, our autonomic pathway, since we have two neuronal pathway, and we have a synapse out in the body somewhere, we're going to have a ganglion now associated with the autonomic nervous system. If this terminology is still a little bit confusing, I'm trying to get you familiar with it. I'm going to show you a picture to explain all of this in a minute. So let's finish off the slide. Autonomic motor pathway is a two neuronal pathway, right? It's going to innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland, right? Not skeletal muscle. You don't have conscious control over it. The two neurons are called preganglionic neuron. So that's the neuron going into the synapse, and the ganglionic neuron. So the ganglionic neuron is inside the ganglion. So it's on the other side of the synapse. It's receiving. Preganglionic is sending, ganglionic is receiving. Where do you find the preganglionic neuron? It's going to be in the lateral gray horn, at least for the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Ganglionic neuron is housed in the neuron. Let's go to the picture. So here we have a preganglionic neuronal cell body. You should know, when I say the word preganglionic neuronal cell body, you should know this is going to be in the lateral gray horn of the spinal cord, because that's something we learned last time. So preganglionic cell body is in the lateral gray horn of the spinal cord. Its axon, which is called preganglionic axon, because it's the axon of the preganglionic neuron, its axon is going to leave, because it's motor information, it's going to leave by that anterior rootlets, anterior root, so on and so forth. So it is going to exit the spinal cord, and it has to go to a ganglia, right? Because that's where it's going to have its synapse. Because in a ganglia is a collection of neuronal cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, right? So this is where you're going to find the postganglionic axon. Or more correctly, I'm getting ahead of myself, the axon of the preganglionic neuron, that axon leaves the spinal cord, enters the peripheral nervous system, and then enters a ganglion, where you will find ganglionic neuronal cell bodies, and it will synapse there. And then the axon of a ganglionic neuron is called a postganglionic axon, because it's the axon after the ganglion. This will then innervate and service your particular effector. The example given here is smooth muscle. So you're starting to see word soup that I call it. Is a whole bunch of complicated terminology. But if you're understanding these definitions of solid, you can build one on top of the other. Right? All these terms all sound the same. And in other classes, if you just remember something that kind of sounds something sort of like that, you can kind of find something you sort of remember something about in the multiple choice question, and then just connect the two, and then you get credit for it. That's not going to work here, right? You need to have a very clear understanding of these definitions. So let me go through this one more time, and I hope to make it a little bit more smooth. Motor pathways for the autonomic motor system have a two neuronal pathway. The first neuron, its cell body, is housed in the lateral gray horn of the spinal cord. That cell body is called the preganglionic neuron. Its axon, the preganglionic axon, exits via the anterior root and is then going to enter a ganglion, because a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So the neuronal cell bodies in the ganglion are called ganglionic neuronal cell bodies. So the preganglionic axon will synapse on the ganglionic neuronal cell body. Now we're at step 2 in our neuronal pathway. So the axon leaving the ganglion is called the postganglionic axon, and that will then go in synapse on our effector, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland. Okay, so these next few slides say in words what I've just described. Right? The first neuron in the autonomic pathway is the preganglionic neuron, and its cell body is either in the lateral gray horn of the spinal cord or it's in particularly the brain stem. But we'll look at those details in a little bit. Preganglionic axon extends to the second cell body housed within an autonomic ganglion. So that is a ganglion associated with the autonomic nervous system, right? Which is a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. The second neuron of the pathway is called a ganglionic neuron. And its axon, the postganglionic axon, extends from the ganglion to its target, smooth, cardiac, or a gland. Okay, now that brings us back to this table. So remember, we had a receptor and the dendrite of a somatic sensory neuron going to the spinal cord, one pathway in. Then we have one pathway out, somatic motor, cell body, somatic motor neuron, housed in the anterior gray horn. Its axon goes directly to the skeletal muscle. In the autonomic nervous system, by contrast, we have one neuronal pathway in, but a two neuronal pathway out. So the neuronal pathway in, the afferent information, visceral sensory neuron will be picking up unconscious sensory information. So its dendrites you can see coming in through this pathway. Remember, the posterior gray horn still contains the cell bodies of somatic and visceral sensory neurons. Right? Its axon, again, projects into the posterior gray horn. So the visceral sensory neuron and the autonomic sensory neuron, same. Just one controls things you're conscious over, one you're not. Now, the big change is in the efferent information, the stuff leaving your central nervous system. So here, one neuronal pathway. In the autonomic, we have two. So in this example, cell body of the preganglionic neuron is housed in the lateral gray horn of the spinal cord. Right? Its axon leaves by the anterior root and then goes to a ganglion, a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So here, the preganglionic axon will synapse with the ganglionic neuron. The axon of the ganglionic neuron then leaves the ganglion, right? The postganglionic axon then goes and innervates the particular target organ. Hopefully now you have a nice comparison between somatic nervous system, one neuronal pathway in, one neuronal pathway out. Autonomic nervous system, one neuronal pathway in, two neuronal pathway out. Okay, now you might be asking yourself, why? Right? What is the benefit of having a two neuronal pathway as part of our autonomic nervous system? Well, it allows for these two possibilities, neuronal convergence and neuronal divergence. So neuronal convergence, axons from numerous preganglionic cells synapse on a single ganglionic cell. So you have multiple preganglionic axons coming to the same ganglion. So what this means is you can turn on your ganglionic neuron from multiple pathways, right? You have many ways of turning on the same thing. This thing over here in your brain can turn that on. This thing over here in your brain can turn that on. This thing over here in your brain can turn that on. By contrast, in neuronal divergence, axons from one preganglionic cell synapse with numerous ganglionic cells. So one preganglionic neuron talks to many different ganglionic neurons. Let's see if I have a picture that I'm trying to get at here. You can see that here. I'll jump ahead. So, pre-ganglionic neuron branching and synapsing with many different ganglionic neurons, right? This would be an example of neuronal divergence. Over here, not super clearly shown, but if it showed multiple pre-ganglionic neurons all coming to the same ganglion, that would be neuronal convergence, right? So do you get lots of things in step one coming in on step two, or do you get one step one branching to many step two, if that makes sense? So why would you want to do one over the other? Well, neuronal convergence, as I mentioned before, allows multiple sections of the brain to control the same system. Neuronal divergence allows one area of the brain to turn on many functions in the body. And we'll see why that is in a little bit. Okay, so here is a nice table outlining the importance or characteristics of the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Definitely check out this information because it will help you. Okay, so now we need to start talking in more detail about the divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Up until this point, we've talked about the neuronal, two neuronal pathway, right? This is true for both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions. So remember, parasympathetic, homeostasis, rest and digest. Sympathetic is your fight or flight, response to acute stress. Okay, so structurally over here, the parasympathetic division is shown in green. Notice it is concentrated up here in the brainstem and in the very last little bit of the spinal cord. So it's telling you parasympathetic division, its functions are rest and digest, homeostasis, right? Its origin, where does it start from? Preganglionic neurons, that's the first neuron in the two neuronal pathway. Preganglionic neurons are located in the brainstem, up here in green, and in S2 and S4, the sacral region of the spinal cord. What structures or nerves are involved? Well, we have up here, we have 4 major cranial nerves, and down here we have the spinal nerves of S2 through S4. In contrast, over here in the sympathetic division, preganglionic neurons are located in the lateral horns from T1 to L2. So this area in purple, this is where you're going to find preganglionic neurons associated with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. These are the guys going to be doing the fight or flight response. Now, this here is the spinal cord. On either side, we have a structure called the sympathetic trunk, right? Sympathetic meaning having to do with the sympathetic nervous system, and trunk, don't know exactly how to explain this. It is a connection, a series of structures, right? If you did wiring, you know, sometimes they use this terminology, wiring. Anyway, let us proceed. Some more differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. In the parasympathetic division, we have a preganglionic neuron that has a very long preganglionic axon, compared to the sympathetic division where we have a much shorter preganglionic axon. But that axon is highly branched. Over here, in the parasympathetic division, typically very few collaterals. It's not highly branched. Notice both preganglionic axons are myelinated. Both of them are going to extend into ganglia, collections of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. There where you will find the cell bodies, the somas of your ganglionic neurons, right? You're going to have a synapse, and then you're going to have that axon leaving the ganglia of the ganglionic axon. So this is a post-ganglionic axon. These axons are unmyelinated. So neuron number 1 is myelinated, neuron number 2 is not myelinated, and that is important for reasons we'll see in a little bit. Okay, so let me repeat this for clarity's sake. In the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, we have a preganglionic neuron, right? It has a very long preganglionic axon that is myelinated. That axon will extend through the body to the ganglia, where it will synapse with a ganglionic neuron. The postganglionic axon of that neuron is relatively short and unmyelinated. In contrast, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron, its preganglionic axon is much shorter and is highly branched, but is still myelinated. So the ganglion is much closer to where you will find the preganglionic neuron. Because the ganglionic neuron, its postganglionic axon is very long, but still unmyelinated. Now, all these little details that I pointed out is important to understand and get really clear so you can understand the material that's coming later. Now, when you look at this, right, I had jumped ahead. Parasympathetic nervous system, if you look at the structure of the preganglionic neuron, this suits itself well to neuronal convergence. Whereas in the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic axon has many branches, so that will lend itself to neuronal divergence. And if you think about it for a second, this makes total sense. What does your sympathetic nervous system control? Fight or flight. When you activate the system, you need a whole bunch of things turned on right now, right? You need to start breaking down glycogen to form glucose. Glucose needs to be released into your blood system. You need to increase blood pressure. You need to increase heart rate. You need to increase your respiratory rate. You need to mobilize a whole bunch of other things, right? There's just hundreds and hundreds of things that need to happen, and they all have to happen right now because that tiger is about ready to sink its fangs into you. No time to mess around, right? When that alarm bell goes off, you want like 2 dozen systems turned on as quickly as you can. So it makes sense that you activate one preganglionic neuron of your autonomic nervous system. It will then go turn on your respiratory system, turn on, your energy mobilization, your metabolism. You can turn on many different things. However, with the parasympathetic, there's not that much of a rush. You can take care of things kind of one at a time, right? You take a meal, you have a big meal, you don't need to excite your entire body, right? You don't even need to excite your entire GI system all at once, right? As you're eating food, right, you don't have to have lots of massive activity the rest in your GI system. You do a little, but anyway, the point I'm trying to say is, right, when you're eating, what are the kinds of things you need to excite, right? You need to excite salivary glands and muscles that control swallowing. Then the food gets to your stomach. You need innervation to control what's going on in your stomach. And then when that's done, you can then just turn on the first part of your small intestine, then the middle part of your small intestine, then the last part of your small intestine, then the first part of your colon, then the middle part of your colon, then the last part of your colon, right? Each of these things can be handled one at a time. So having neuronal convergence makes this process a little bit easier, whereas having neuronal divergence, in the case of sympathetic division, makes that job easier. It just depends on what you're trying to do. I do want you to have an understanding between the structure of the preganglionic neuron. Is it branched or unbranched? How is that going to affect neuronal divergence, neuronal convergence? Which of these two things are you going to want for a generalized response? Acute stress response, you want neuronal divergence, right? And this is why the sympathetic diversion of the autonomic nervous system has many collaterals in its preganglionic neuron. Having some confusion over the word soup, right? Check out this table. It will definitely help break things down. Now, for the last part of part one, I'm going to start talking about the parasympathetic division of the ANS. Right? This is sometimes also called the craniosacral division. Remember where the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons are found? In the brainstem and the very last portion of the spinal cord. Let me just read it. Termed craniosacral division because the preganglionic neurons are housed within nuclei of the brainstem and in the lateral gray horn of the sacral region of the spinal cord. Ganglionic neurons, right, neuron number 2, are found in terminal ganglia. So these are a group of ganglia that are close to the target organ be affected, the digestive system or whatever, right? Or in intramural ganglia. What this means is the ganglia is actually in the wall of the organ. So if you're a terminal ganglion, you are right next to the organ. If you're an intramural ganglion, you're actually in the wall of the organ. So let me just read through this and relate it back to a previous slide. Ganglionic neurons are found either in terminal ganglia, far away from the central nervous system and right close to their target organ, in either terminal or intramural ganglia. Look at the structure of a parasympathetic ganglionic neuron. It has a really long axon. Why? Because it has to go from the CNS all the way to the target organ, or almost to the target organ. If that ganglion is right next to the target organ, the postganglionic axon only needs to be really short because most of the distance has already been traveled. Okay, so that's what this picture shows. Notice cell bodies of preganglionic neurons are up here in the brainstem or down here in the sacral region of the spinal cord. They're going to have relatively long preganglionic axons, which are going to go to a ganglia relatively near the target organ. Right? Notice that the post-ganglionic axons are short, right? So the short ones, the step 2 neuron, axon for neuron number 2, are shown in gray, and they're much, much shorter. So ganglia is located closer to the target organ, further away from the central nervous system. Right? And they just break down which nerves feed into which structures. But notice that by and large, parasympathetic is broken down into 2 main regions here, right? Brainstem and the inferior portion of the spinal cord, nothing in between. That's the domain of the sympathetic division of the ANS. Okay, so let's talk about the superior portion first. Cranial components, right? There are 4 cranial nerves associated with the parasympathetic division of the ANS. Oculomotor, facial, glossopharyngeal, and the big one, the vagus nerve. So let's talk about the first one, oculomotor. Preganglionic cell bodies are housed in the midbrain, okay? Postganglionic cell bodies are located in the ciliary ganglion, within the orbit, right? Ciliary, in this case, means having to do with the eye. Postganglionic axons project to the ciliary muscles and to the pupillary constrictor muscles. So these are the muscles that are going to make your pupils constrict, get smaller. So big black holes that come down to small little points. That's what this is in charge of, constriction of the pupils. Lots of extra light, pupils constrict. Right. So when pupils get small, that is through the action of the parasympathetic nervous system. Facial nerve, 2 branches, right, of the facial nerve exit the pons. The greater petrosal nerve terminates at the pteriopalatine ganglion. Right? Remember, like pterygoid process right? Pterygopalatine, palate means the kind of the roof of your mouth, terminates at the pterygopalatine ganglion, innervates lacrimal glands, right? So stimulation of these are going to lead to crying, lead to tears, right? Innervates lacrimal glands, small glands of the nasal cavity, meaning mucosal glands, and the palate. Chorda tympani terminates at the submandibular ganglion, right? Innervates the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. So we have salivary glands underneath the mandible and underneath the tongue, controlled by these nerves here. Glossopharyngeal nerve, preganglionic axons exit the brainstem. Preganglionic axons branch and synapse of the ganglionic neurons in the otic ganglion. Otic ganglion. Postganglionic axons cause an increase in secretion from the parotid salivary glands. Parotid salivary glands. Vagus nerve, right? Vagus nerve does a whole lot. Projects inferiorly through the neck and supply innervation to the thoracic and abdominal organs, most of the abdominal organs. The vagus nerve is a big, important cranial nerve, pretty much taking care of everything in your ventral cavity. You're not taking care of it, but associated with it. Multiple branches extend through the thoracic organs, increase mucus production, decrease diameter of airways, right? So this would be associated with or along the same lines as having like asthma. Right? Your bronchoconstriction, your airways get smaller and you start producing more mucus. Right? Also serves to decrease heart rate. So your heart starts beating slower and decreases the force of your heart contraction. It means your cardiac output drops. So you have fewer heartbeats in a minute, and each heartbeat will expel less blood. Right? So this would be an example of resting. Vagal trunks pass to the diaphragm. So they're going to pass through the diaphragm following the aorta and are going to then branch and associate with the very organs in your abdominal cavity. Increase smooth muscle motility and secretion activity in the digestive tract. Right? So helping regulate or activating those structures to help you digest your food. Last one, pelvic splenic nerves. So preganglionic neuron cell bodies are housed within the lateral gray horns of S2 through S4 spinal cord segment. Okay, so what we've done, just to make sure that you haven't fallen asleep, right, once we cover the vagus nerve, we cover the superior portion. We cover the parts that are coming out of the brainstem. Now, boop, we're dropping down here to the sacral region of the spinal cord. Okay. So preganglionic axons branch from pelvic splenic nerves, which contribute to the superior and inferior hypogastric plexus. Don't worry too much about that. Preganglionic fibers project into the ganglionic neurons with terminal or intramural ganglia of, and this is where it gets useful, this is where it gets what I want you to know, large intestine, rectum, reproductive organs, urinary bladder, and distal ureter. So basically the end of the ureters. Okay. So these things are going to be controlled by pelvic splenic nerves, part of your parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, your rest and digest. That brings us to the end of part one. In part two, we'll start talking about more particulars of the sympathetic diversion of the autonomic nervous system. Again, there's a lot of terminology in this section. So keep a list of notes, read the book, listen to this lecture several times. One thing I will say is what is more important here is big picture concepts, right? The exactitude of the pelvic splenic nerves and the fact that they are going to form the inferior and superior hypogastric plexus, little less important than knowing pelvic splenic nerves are going to control things in your pelvic cavity, right? Associated with resting and digesting, like your intestines, rectum, reproductive organs, and so on, right? Other things that are really important, right? Know where in the CNS you will find your preganglionic neurons. and your ganglionic neurons. Where are they going to be found? Right? What are the differences in the pathways or the structure of the parasympathetic versus the sympathetic? What are the differences between the somatic motor and the autonomic nervous system? Those are the kinds of things I really want you to have clear. The exact details of what branch forms what structure, a little less important. All right, hopefully that will help narrow things down for you. I will see you next time.